Well, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. It's a beautiful day outside, so thank you for coming and joining this, this gathering. We're very happy to have you and to have our speaker today. First of all, our program. This is the Reimagining World Order community, which is part of the PIIRS family, along with the Brazil Lab and other components. We all are here doing our things. The Reimagining World Order program does lots of activities, and Tolya Levshin, the postdoc fellow, Dr. Levshin, is working with me and others this year on this program. We have talks such as today, we have workshops, an annual conference, and podcasts, and we even teach a course. So we are multitasking in real time. This year, we are in this Reimagining World Order program, our third year. We are focusing on and broadening the angle away from the Western international order to broader conceptions of order, the non-Western order, the global South, and we are working across fields and disciplines. We're interdisciplinary, bringing history, diplomacy, social theory, and international relations together. So in that spirit, we are just absolutely happy to have our guest speaker today, Matias Spektor, who is a visiting fellow in the Reimagining World Order program, and he's also a non-resident fellow this year at the Carnegie Endowment. It's just thrilling to have him here. And the way I think about Matias for the year, not just today, but for the whole year at Princeton, is that you are a translator, a interpreter, a bridge builder between the North and the South, between letting some of us know more and understand better about Latin America, about Brazil, and the other way around. So moving in both directions, North to South, South to North. So thank you, Matias. Matias is a professor and founding director of the School of International Relations at FGV Institute in Sao Paulo. That institute and that school in particular opened its doors in 2019. The FGV is a major presence in Brazil. University of Pennsylvania rated your institute the top think tank in Latin America. So great things are being done there. Matias was educated at Oxford, and he has been a visiting professor at the Wilson Center, at the Council on Foreign Relations, and at the LSE in London. He has written widely on many topics, US policy towards Latin America, towards Brazil, Kissinger and Brazil, a book that he's written early in his career. And he's written on the history and theory of nuclear cooperation, including a chapter in this book, a brilliant chapter he wrote for this book, The Age of Hiroshima, that I edited with Robert Gordon from the history department here. And Matias has a wonderful chapter looking at how Brazil and more generally the global South responded to Hiroshima, to the atomic revolution, the rise of civilian atomic energy, and the ambivalence and complexity of confronting that, and more generally modernity as it was parceled out by the North and by the United States. So just a lot of very interesting work. His most recent work, and what I think we will hear today, is focused on climate change in the global South. We are very much looking forward to his presentation. Matias will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for Q&A. We also have people online, so they will also have a chance. If you hear me, you will have a chance to ask questions as well. So Matias, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your comments.
Oh, thank you, John. That's a very generous introduction. And thank you everyone for coming. It's a beautiful Friday afternoon outside, so I'm truly touched. Thank you for being here. Thank you also, may I say, to PIIRS. I have to confess, I didn't know of PIIRS before coming to Princeton, and what a phenomenal place it is. I'm really delighted to be a fellow with PIIRS. What I want to do today is approach to the best of my ability a big important political question that doesn't get asked as much as it should get asked these days. And I'll do this by way of drawing insights from a series of survey experiments that my colleagues and I have been fielding in Brazil and in Latin America over the past 12 months. And the reason I want to do this is I want to spend my time at Princeton for the year trying to turn all of these insights into a research program on climate change politics in the global South. So it's very ambitious, and this is a great opportunity to me because it allows me to get early feedback from you and try and avoid the most obvious mistakes that I'm bound to make as I venture in the field. So here's the question. As the United States becomes far more involved in global climate politics, and US allies alongside the United States create a new pattern of ordering around climate change, where are we likely to see conflict between North and South? Of course, there's a trove of writing going all the way back to the 1970s on North-South conflict around climate change. In fact, the early days of the global climate regime in the 1970s were all about North-South tension. And it'd be silly of me to try and summarize that literature because it's 5 decades of writing on North-South tensions around the environment. But for the purpose of context today, the one thing that stands out, the bulk of the literature is about coalitional politics. So it's literature that asks questions about, the conditions under which the global South can unite to put pressure on the global North. The conditions under which the United States and its European allies can crack the Southern coalition. It's questions about when does cooperation between North and South obtain? When do Northern countries collude to screw up the South? When do Southern countries collude to screw up the North? Those types of coalition, collective action type problems. What doesn't get asked, and this is what I would like to do, is what are the beliefs in the South and in the North that make up the social world in which these coalitions are embedded? It was very hard only 5 years ago to ask these questions, to run surveys on these issues, because these issues had little, if any, salience at all. And yet in the last 5 years, these issues, to be sure in the United States, but around the world, have gained a salience that is new. So we now can ask important questions about beliefs around climate change and how they shape domestic politics in the North, in the South, and in the relationship between North and South. If I may, I want to make a comment about the state of the literature today. If you look within the discipline of political science, which is where John and I, it's the field we inhabit. Within that field, there's been lots of work in the last 5 years in American politics, trying to understand variation, subnational units, which states adopt pro-climate policy, which states don't, how does it work, what do Americans believe about climate change, how does social psychology shape voter preferences, how do parties aggregate or fail to aggregate climate action, so on and so forth. And there's a lot of work in comparative politics, but the bulk of work in comparative politics on comparative climate politics is comparing the United States and Europe. There's no theory that we know of climate change politics in the global South. Comparing different countries in the global South as they approach the issue of climate change, and very little on North-South beyond the study of coalitional politics. And don't get me wrong, coalitional politics are super important. They're as important in the climate sphere in 2022 as they were in 1982, to be sure. But let me try and give you a few ideas, a couple of ideas of how we might productively approach and engage this question of, as the United States and its allies reorder the world around climate change, as the liberal international order that John has written about confronts and organizes global debates about climate change and global conflict around climate change, what sort of reactions do we get from the South? And I want to begin with an assumption. Do you have a point? Oh, because I haven't started playing with slides. I'm preserving you for what's coming. I'll be there in a minute, Dimitri. I'm just building it up. So I want to begin by inviting you to assume with me that we are under a sea change in the American posture on climate change, that in the last few years, in the last 5 years to be sure, but in the last 2 years in particular, there's been a dramatic change in how the United States positions itself in the global politics of climate change. Of course, if you talk to activists, this is wonderful news because finally, the most powerful state on earth, the wealthiest society on earth, and one of the biggest carbon emitters in the world is confronting the problem head on. And this is to be celebrated. This is great. But if you know your global South, you also know that as a result of new American assertion in the field, the United States is bound to bump up against those countries that are outside the Western, the US-led Western liberal formation. And we need to map out where conflict emerges and why, the conditions under which we might prevent that conflict from emerging, and what solutions we might creatively come up with. So by my assumption that something is changing, and I think it's a fair assumption to make, let me give you a brief list of things that have happened in the last 24 months alone. In 2020, the Biden campaign put out a climate plan. The climate plan says that it should be the policy of the United States to name and shame climate outlaws without specifying what an outlaw means, because depending on how you look at international law, the United States is a big outlaw. But it's about naming and shaming climate outlaws. I can see the Brazils and Indians and Indonesians and the South Africans going crazy already. Not to speak of the Russians, of course. The Pentagon in 2021 put out a document in which it says, I believe for the first time that climate change is a risk to American national security, with the enormous implications that has for the way the United States interprets international law and the authorization of the use of force under international law. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, wonderful name for a climate law. This mystifies foreigners like me. Why can't we call it a climate law? Is really green industrial policy explicitly geared towards taking on China and Russia. But not only China and Russia, it's geared towards transforming how international trade works. And no wonder talk in Washington now, everywhere in Washington now, is about the possibility of changing global trade rules. And, you know, there's talk about carbon taxes at the border, which would transform the way the United States deals with the World Trade Organization and with the legal infrastructure of global trade. In the last 6 months, the US Securities and Exchange Commission has begun to mandate corporate disclosures on climate impact. The IMF and the World Bank are now asking the countries that borrow from them to produce inventories of their climate assets. Private banking organizations have been forced by the US Congress to integrate sustainability into the way they assess investment decisions. Scholars on the pages of foreign affairs and policymakers and pundits in Washington are calling for the creation of climate clubs in which, rather than negotiate deals in the United Nations when each country has a vote and a voice, move away from the UN, which is backwards and slow and packed with drama, move on to like-minded clubs of like-minded states that will come up with new rules and will determine who's a member and who's not a member of those clubs. And of course, finally, there is a big push in American civil society, but also in European civil society, to reinterpret the global commons. And this reinterpretation is a reinterpretation that says, well, in the age of climate crisis, maybe national sovereignty should be reinterpreted. The biggest expression of this in the policy world, I think, is in France. Emmanuel Macron, of all statesmen, is the one, I think, who's made the clearest argument to suggest that countries that have sovereign jurisdiction over critical biomes on Earth are not the proprietors of those assets. They are the guardians of those assets. If these ideas were to pick up, this is a true revolution in our understanding of how international law works, how sovereignty works, so on and so forth. So this is a highly revisionist agenda. So I'm trying to turn around the way we normally think about these things. We normally think of the United States and Western Europe as conservative status quo powers. They benefit from the distribution of power in the international system against a revolutionary third world that complains about the rules, that hesitates to comply with the rules, and that needs to be brought into compliance. But on this issue, it's the United States and its allies that are the revisionist power, confronting in the global South all sorts of countries. The biggest countries are very conservative, but the smallest countries are not conservative at all. In fact, some of the most revisionist countries in the world on the climate issue are the small island states who are facing extinction. And rightly so, they're revisionist. So if you've accepted all of these assumptions, then you will understand that the two questions I'm trying to tackle are really quite important. First of all, will these new forms of social and material coercion engender backlash? Is there going to be a third world, a global South backlash against the transformations that we're seeing in the climate sphere? And secondly, and crucially, will these changes induce a new demand for climate skepticism in the global South? Domestic demand for climate skepticism in the global South. Not for a minute am I suggesting that the global South will react to these things uniformly. There's loads of variation in the global South. And it's precisely because there is this variation that I think we need the tools to make sense of what is going on. And I suggest that the best way to approach this is by looking first at Latin America. And the reason for this is not merely that Latin America is home to some of the critical biomes on Earth, or that climate change impact is felt everywhere, but with a lot of variation. So it's interesting to find out good theoretical ideas, or that climate policy is everywhere in Latin America, and again, lots of variation, but also because Latin America is a sphere of influence. It's one region of the world where there is regional hegemony. So if we want to understand North-South tensions as the United States reasserts itself in the field, this is a good place in the global South to look at. And then once we have insight from Latin America, we can do interesting comparisons. The most obvious one is with Southeast Asia. My dream is someone writing a PhD thesis on climate change politics, comparing Brazil and Indonesia. But one can think of as well countries in Africa, and in particular in the Congo Basin, where some of the dynamics, land use, deforestation, the dramas afflicting climate change politics in Latin America occur as well. So now I'm ready for the PowerPoint at very long last. So Tolia, what I'm doing now is I'm sharing the screen. Is that right? Okay, great, thank you. So Yeah? Okay. So these are the two questions I want to tackle. And as I said, I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations. First, looking at a survey experiment my colleagues and I ran in Brazil, and then looking at a big, massive survey in 7 countries in Latin America, trying to produce micro foundations for the responses that we are seeing. So Joe Biden, first presidential debate, September 2020. Here are 3 things he said about climate politics and Brazil during that debate. First of all, the rainforests of Brazil are being torn down, are being ripped down. So there you have your naming and shaming right there. Then he said, the countries of the world need to put together $20 billion and turn to the Brazilians and say, here's $20 billion. Fix it. Positive inducement. And then he said, and if you don't fix it, then you're going to face trade sanctions, negative inducement. So following the script from his climate plan, naming and shaming, followed by positive inducement, and if not, then negative inducement. Bolsonaro responded, and Bolsonaro was divided by the 2 messages coming from Washington. His first response was pure reactance. Here's what he said. How do we deal with this threat from the United States? Diplomacy is not enough. When talk is done, we reach for gunpowder. Sort of doubling down. And then 5 months later, he sent the first letter to Biden asking for the $20 billion, engendering a huge moral hazard problem, because now you have members of the Bolsonaro cabinet saying, well, actually, we shouldn't resolve the climate problem now. Let the forest burn if the Americans are willing to pay for it, until we're in a good position to extract maximum concessions from the United States. And they said it overtly. What does international relations theory tell us about these dynamics? When there is naming and shaming coming from abroad, how do populations respond? Climate change has all sorts of effects. So IR theory tells us there are 4 possible responses, right? And this comes from the literature on naming and shaming around human rights, mostly. So when there is foreign climate shaming, the first response by the people of the target state could be an expression of regret, remorse, and promising to do better in the future. Another response could be to reject the criticism by questioning the motivations of the critic. A third response could be to be quiet, do nothing, and wait for it to pass. And then there's the 4th response, and this is the one we need to worry about. This is the dangerous response, and this is defiance. And defiance means doubling down on non-compliant behavior. So my colleagues and I said, okay, given the story with Bolsonaro, and the story I just showed you, it was everywhere on the Brazilian press for about a year, because it was Biden, but it was also Macron hitting Bolsonaro hard. The question we're asking is, under what conditions will the Brazilian people try to defy the critic rather than do any of the other things? Because this is the dangerous thing. This is what one wants to avoid. And we tested various dimensions of foreign climate coercion. It's a national representative sample of 1,072 Brazilians. This is how we ran our experiment. And we were looking at different types of coercion dynamics. So we were looking at different types of obligation. Is the critic using a moral language or a legal language? Is the critic a hypocrite? When Biden comes and critiques Brazil, and you inform the respondent that although there is criticism, US companies still buy stuff from the Amazon forest that contributes to the destruction of the forest. Does that have an effect? We were looking at the frame of the criticism. Is the critic a liberal internationalist that uses cosmopolitan language, such as saying, well, the Amazon may belong to Brazil, but it has enormous effect on the whole of humanity. So there's a shared responsibility for the Amazon, or is the critic centering the language of the criticism around Brazilian interests? You shouldn't burn the Amazon because you hurt Brazilian people and the Brazilian people's interests. We're looking at different types of threat. The threat could be a threat of economic sanctions, as we saw. It could be the threat of the use of military force, and it could be diplomatic sanctions. And then we were looking at whether the critic had a reputation for resolve. Is the critic a country that stands firm? When they make a threat, they act on that threat. So we played with these ideas, and these are the results. We identified two general triggers, two things that trigger Brazilian people to defy the criticism. The first one is hypocrisy. If the source of the criticism is hypocritical, triggers defiance. And the other thing, and this absolutely mystifies me, and I think it's fascinating, it's the threat of the use of military force. So in an experiment, if the respondent is confronted with foreign climate criticism that threatens to use military force, people are more willing to defy rather than comply. This is really dangerous, and it's a new dynamic in international relations that we should attend to, and we should run the same test in other developing countries. We also found that ideology is crucial in determining who defies and who doesn't defy. And a lot of the defiance is the pulling power of the right. Individuals who self-identify as right-wingers in Brazil are doing the heavy lifting here. And they also want to defy the critic when the critic uses liberal internationalist, cosmopolitan language. Should one worry about the right? Yes, of course, one should worry about the right, because afterwards, in many places around the world, the right is winning votes. This is the Brazilian lower house today. In blue, you see the right-wing coalition. This is the new composition of the lower house that was elected last week and will take office on the 1st of January. The right, you can't see because it's too tiny, but the right made significant improvements. Not as significant there as here. This is the Senate today, and the Senate as of the 1st of January. So we should worry about this. We should worry about this for another reason. Here's two people. To the right is Marina Silva. Marina Silva was President Lula's Minister for the Environment during his first term. She's the leading environmentalist in the Global South, and she's responsible for putting together the state response under the first Lula administration that curbed carbon emissions for the first time. So deforestation in the Amazon forest went down, and went down very dramatically in the first Lula administration, thanks to her. She was then booted out in the second term because she clashed with another minister who would then go on to become Brazil's president, Dilma Rousseff. Here we have Bolsonaro's Minister for the Environment, Ricardo Salles. He's the guy responsible for dismantling the state capacity that she built up in the early 2000s. Both got elected to the lower chamber last Sunday. Both of them got elected in the district of São Paulo, where I live. Here's the detail. He got 3 times as many votes as she did, campaigning on an anti-climate platform. Why? Up until this election, climate change was not the subject of programmatic politics at all. What's going on that an anti-climate message gets 3 times as many votes as the pro-climate message from the leading environmentalist in the country. So surely we need to worry about the right. But here's the detail. We shouldn't worry only about the right, because we now want to know who reacts to foreign climate shaming through defiance that doesn't support Bolsonaro. And we find that people who do not support Bolsonaro also react, also are willing to define. Far less than the right. The right is doing the heavy lifting, but you don't have to self-identify as a right-winger. You don't even have to support Bolsonaro to be triggered by foreign climate criticism when the source of the criticism is hypocritical and when there is the threat of the use of military force in an experiment, of course. Okay, so what's going on? I suspect, and my colleagues suspect, that this is to do with what experts call the Amazon paranoia. The Amazon paranoia is a belief that is prevalent in Brazil. We always knew it was prevalent, according to which there is collusion by the international community to try and control Brazilian reaches in the Amazon. And when you ask people, well, give me an example, they have a very hard time giving you an example, but it's nonetheless a deeply held belief. We knew that from anecdotal evidence, so we tested it. And here's the answer. 95% of respondents believe that there is collusion in the international community to try and control the reaches of the Amazon. Even if when you ask people, give me an example, they don't know, they cannot respond. So we try to find out their motivations. What's motivating the Amazon paranoia? Over 75% of the people say that they, the international community, want to exert control over the forest for economic profit, right? 50+% of the people agree with the notion that this is to do with controlling the forest to ensure survival in a climate crisis moving forward. And around a quarter of respondents say, well, the reason why they want to control the Amazon is really because they're worried about deforestation. This is really worrying. And I don't know where this belief comes from, but we now know how big it is and what the motivations are. We then asked these respondents, when you think about foreign countries criticizing Amazon deforestation, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And a whopping over 60% of the respondents say that the concern by the international community is a smokescreen. That is not true. That is trying to hide their true intention, which is to control the reaches of the Amazon. A little over 20% only think it's to do with a genuine concern for deforestation. This to me is one of the most worrying things about Brazil moving forward, irrespective of who wins the election at the end of the month. So this was my attempt to approach the first question to do with international responses to climate shaming. Let me now move to my second set of examples to do with, as the United States changes its position in the field, will this increase domestic demand for climate skepticism? And for this, we ran a series of surveys in 7 Latin American countries, and we picked those countries that together are responsible for 80% of carbon emissions in the region. This is a sample of over 5,000 people, and we ran these towards the end of 2021. So the good news is, unlike it is the case in the United States, there's absolute social consensus in Latin America that climate change is happening. Unlike it is the case in Europe, there is consensus it's happening. There's Brazil is the lowest one, and it's 94% of the people. There's consensus too that climate change is caused by humans, that the causes of climate change are anthropogenic, which we didn't know. Europe doesn't have these figures. Again, Brazil is the lowest there, and it's 91%. But here comes the problem. When it comes to the severity of climate change, then you have polarization. Then Latin American societies split in half. Around half the people in many of the countries believe climate change is happening, believe it's caused by humans, but are not worried because the impact is not going to be severe. So then the next question is, okay, what determines these sorts of beliefs? What are the determinants of belief in climate change? And I'm going to translate this mess to you. Three important things that I want to highlight. First of all, past experience with extreme weather events is important in accounting for the belief in the existence of climate change, but to my shock, has no impact whatsoever in the belief on the human causes of climate change, and no impact at all on the severity of climate change. This is really worrying because it means that as climate change impact evolves, as extreme weather events happen more regularly, the data is suggesting that individuals are not updating their beliefs, that they're not turning the experience into new knowledge that this is a present threat. This is where skeptics will hit. So climate skeptics in Brazil and in the rest of Latin America know full well they don't need to question whether it exists. Of course it exists. They don't need to question whether humans cause it. They need to question how severe it is. And here's where the problem resides. The other thing that gives me a lot of concern are these two figures. What this says is this: individuals who rank high on a scale of individualistic values are prone to not believe that humans cause climate change, and they're prone to not believe that the impact of climate change is severe. The more individualistic you are, the less you believe. And this is really worrying in Latin America, because one of the features of Latin America is that these are very low trusting societies. Social trust, trust in institutions, but trust in others is really low. According to the last World's Values Survey, a staggering 90% of the Brazilian people say that you cannot trust others. So in societies of the global south, where social capital is scarce, the fact that low social capital correlates with not believing in the severity of climate change should give us pause. Let me look at two other things. Here, ideology does matter. If you're on the left, you're more prone to believe that climate change will have an impact than if you're on the right. And the other thing, and of course, this is my wish for another PhD dissertation, is if you're Latin America and you belong to a Pentecostal evangelical denomination, you do not believe that climate change has severe impact. We need work on religion and climate change beliefs in Latin America. We then ask questions about risk perception. And risk perception is a measure, basically you're asking people how extensive you think this thing is and how immediate you think you will be affected. And overall, Latin Americans rank high, but I want to highlight the determinants of the belief in climate risk. And there are three things I want to highlight. First of all, gender has a phenomenal effect. Latin American women are far more sensitive to the risks of climate change than men, suggesting that there's a great opportunity for communication there. Because now the way Latin American environmentalists confront the issue of climate change is by talking about deforestation and land use. it's very hard to mobilize people around these issues. How about trying to highlight the health impacts of land use change, and then get Latin American women who are responsible for the bulk of health provision in their families and communities across Latin America to get them mobilized? Big important implication there. But the other two things I want to highlight is, first of all, the big psychological variable that explains a perception of risk in climate change is personal worry. It's an internal psychological variable. It is not experienced with extreme weather events. And this is really important because a lot of the work that's coming out now assumes that as the global South confronts more extreme weather events, people will change and mend their ways. They're not acting now, they're not mobilizing politically now, but wait until the floods come and the fire comes. I'm worried, I'm lost for words. So, and now I will come to an end, I promise. What are the future directions? What do we do with this? And this is what I really want to get ideas from you, because this is what I plan to spend most of my time while at Princeton. There are three sets of things, three sets of studies I want to run, 3 papers I want to write with my co-authors. The first one asks the following question. When a country fails to comply with the Paris Accords, and an international panel of experts names and shames this country, is there anything leaders in these countries can do to diminish the costs of not complying? Can they use counter rhetoric? We know from evidence that they use counter rhetoric all the time. Some of them will say, well, you know, countries in the global north have been polluting for 150 years. We only began the other day when we industrialized. That's one counter rhetoric. Another counter rhetoric is, well, we should only comply if they comply as well. So a counter rhetoric of reciprocity. Or they could deploy a counter rhetoric of hypocrisy. Why do they tell us, like Bolsonaro says, why does France ask us to comply if they burned all of their forests? And it doesn't matter that it's a lie that they burned all of their forests, but that's what he's deploying. Do these counter rhetorics have an effect? This is the survey experiment that we're running now, next week. The second question, important question, is when the North is indeed hypocritical, how much does it matter? Because, you know, when you listen to international relations types from the global South, like me, most of us say, well, the United States shouldn't be hypocritical, because when the United States is hypocritical, this undermines US leadership and it undermines the liberal international order. But we know from social psychology that we individuals only believe that others are hypocritical if their hypocrisy comes at a cost to us. Social psychologists tell us that when we benefit from the hypocrisy of others, we don't even interpret their behavior as hypocritical. So maybe if the United States is hypocritical because it's chiding Brazil on the one hand, but on the other keeps buying produce from the Amazon that destroys the Amazon, and you tell the people that, you know, there's destruction, but there's a lot of benefit, you know, there's foreign investment coming in, there's a big lucrative market in the United States for Brazilian beef coming from the Cerrado. Is there a hypocrisy cost? I'm not so sure. We're planning to run these early next year. And then finally, this is the big $1 million question, right? Are there any types of foreign cues that could be informative of the public in the global South and get them to mobilize? And it doesn't have to be foreign countries, you know. The Pope, the current Pope, published an encyclical on the Amazon. If it's the Pope naming and shaming, does that make a difference? Is that better than having Biden or Macron doing it? What about other developing countries? If Costa Rica, which has a good performance preserving the forest, if the president of Costa Rica were to critique Brazil, if Xi Jinping were to put forward an argument in collusion with the United States, a sort of great power concert around climate, would that make a difference? My contention is that if we have answers to these types of questions, then we will be in a position to attend to the plea by Professor Eikenberry to help us reimagine world order moving forward. Thank you.
Set of issues that have come out of this great talk, so thank you, Matias. Well, the floor is open. I actually was going to ask a question about this third line of inquiry, and you're going back to Lula's environmental affairs minister, who was originally quite active, and then, as you said, I got pushed aside. Presumably has a view about what activities in the North might be useful to her when and if she's in a position to make climate policy again and have to be active in government. What is your intuition that she would say about what the global North can do? What is it? Is it all about inducements? Is it ultimately is the main lever that is your hypothesis for number 3? Is the main lever an economic inducement, $20 billion, or are there other normative arguments? Are there other ways in which she can be empowered by transnational and northern kinds of interests? What is your intuition?
That's a great question. So absolutely, she has been empowered by transnational networks. The reason why she became an environmentalist in the first place has to do with her position within a transnational network that developed in the 1980s. And there's a lot of diffusion of good lessons from around the globe that she managed to implement when she was in office. But to your question as to what she'd say, it's actually interesting because I had a meeting with her just before coming to Princeton to present these results to her. And this is one of the bizarre things that happened with us. The last time someone ran a survey on climate-related themes in Latin America, it was in 2007 to 2010. 12 years ago, when climate change was far less salient than it is today. And those surveys there, like Innovarometer being the chief one, they ask sort of general questions, not theory-oriented questions based on what we know about social psychology. So she was very surprised to find out what resilience think, because she herself didn't know. But what I reckon she would say about the North is what she will probably say if Lula wins the election in 2 summers time, because it's likely that she will be in the administration. If that were to be the case, and she put forward a climate action plan, and that plan has a lot of cooperation with the North. But its traditional views of what that cooperation entails. It's basically getting aid from the North to help keep the Amazon forest upstanding, and it's coalitional politics to try to bring back the system to the UN framework and try to make progress that way. Very conservative in the North, right? And my fear is that when you go to Brasilia today, or to São Paulo, where the opposition is, my sense is that most people have a real hard time understanding the profound transformation that's happening in climate policy inside the United States now. There are many people who know how it works. So to go back to your original insight, my view is that the way forward is network development. We need to socialize these people, which is the big thing about new international order. In many respects, for this order to work, you need a transnational network of elites that circulate and get socialized around some.
Closer to the marketplace. Well, this microphone is not taking that well.
Okay. Shall I stand? Okay. But I just finished.
So the floor is open. Thank you, Matias.
Why don't each person introduce the work about and
My name is Heather Penneter. I'm a PhD student in the politics department working with John and my fourth year. And I work on sovereignty. So thank you for your talk. This was really lovely. So my question is on the backlash to kind of US-led efforts to make progress on climate change in Brazil specifically. And you said that you kind of like the case of Brazil because it's existing in this region that has a regional hegemon of the US. So that could remove some kind of other complications in looking at this case. But I'm wondering if you think this backlash is like specifically backlash to the US because there's such a history of kind of US imposition and violations of sovereignty that of course kind of any US effort would be seen with suspicion. Or do you think kind of if other states kind of more conventionally seen as outsiders to a US-led international order stepped in, would this be kind of granted with legitimacy or would it be treated with more suspicion of all these international actors want to exploit the Brazilian workforce?
That's a great question, Heather. So we were super worried about this when we were running the experiments because we thought if we name the nation, we get a big confounder. Because it could be that people associate criticism coming from the United States with any factor for which we're not controlling. And the same if we use China or France. So we didn't name the shamer. We spoke of a country, right? This introduces other problems, of course, not naming the source. But we made this choice as well because in the experimental literature, in particular around human rights, one of the recommendations they make is to begin with, to establish a baseline, don't name the shamer. Then you can. What we did mention is that the criticism comes from a state and not from a non-state actor. So it's not, you know, Greenpeace or the Pope.
Just to follow up on it, don't you think in not naming, because this is a region that has a regional hegemon, do you think that could be kind of implicitly rooted in participants' minds?
Yes, absolutely. You're right. It could be rooted. With one exception, the leading voice against wildfires in the Amazon has not been the United States, but France. And that's a good, I don't know how many Brazilians know who Emmanuel Macron is, right? I have no idea. But you're right. This is, you know, these are the trade-offs that you confront when you run an experiment. That's why I think the ideal thing now, the next step, is to run this thing in other places, right? And have a basis for comparison, because I'm sure that if you run this in India, you'd find similar results, and Indonesia as well, I would have thought. About the what effects? Okay. These are great questions. Thank you. So on the first one, I don't know what the answer is because we didn't test a scenario in which the critic is an international organization. But one of the things we did find in the big regional survey is that one of the most powerful determinants of belief in climate change in the region is the belief there is a scientific consensus around climate change. And this is particularly powerful in societies where social trust is very low. People don't trust anyone, not even scientists. But if all scientists get together and there is scientific consensus, then you have a chance. So my gut reaction, Wujan, would be to tell you this. I don't know what would happen if we tested the United Nations critiquing, but I think if we were to test an independent panel of scientific experts passing judgment on Latin America's performance under the Paris Accords, I reckon that would command the attention and respect of the public that we're looking at, rather than immediate negative reaction, I think. On the issue of the boomerang effect, I'll tell you this, there's no doubt that in all fields, ranging from climate change to human rights to free trade, success in Latin America has to do with tying up your government to an international norm, right? That was very confusing. Let me translate. The demand for liberal internationalism in Latin America is relatively low. These are largely closed economies. Liberal sentiment is limited. Commitment to liberal international norms has always been limited, with only a few exceptions. So processes of tying up these countries to liberal international norms and institutions has always been highly contested domestically in these countries. In fact, John won't remember this, but the first time I met John in Rio many years ago, the first question he asked me was, where are the Brazilian liberals? And my reaction was, well, let's look for them together, because I don't know. I can't find them either. So a major mechanism for these individuals has been to tie up the country to these international norms and use that as a segue to policy change at home. This, in human rights, as you say, this is absolutely massive. The leading examples are Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, which in the aftermath of brutal dictatorship signed on to all sorts of international norms and institutions that would empower domestic liberals to try and tie the hands of illiberal domestic players and the battles that ensue. And I'm fairly sure that in the climate sphere, a similar story applies. But then you need to reconcile that story with the Amazon paranoia, with the belief that you have to be distrustful of foreigners because there is an international collusion to try and use the language of climate protection for other obscure ends.
I told you, were you calling on me by chance?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, you're all but inaudible, unfortunately. The microphones from the ceiling don't pick up as much of the sound as the microphone that Matias has there. Just saying. Anyway, I was trying to read the nonverbals to figure out whether I was being called on there.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, anyway, sorry I can't be with you there, but I love this project. I think it's great. I do have a question that perhaps stretches the history out a little bit, that may or may not help frame this, which is how much of this is an older or enters into an older set of dynamics and tensions between the global north and the global south. I mean, I like how you frame this as a maybe a banana peel in the system, as we get global compliance. In fact, big parts of the world peel away from the coalitions that you're talking about, that we need to double down on the energy transition. But there's an older narrative, right, in which this may be a part, which is the conflict over development. When we see this collision, it's really about the use of natural resources and frontiers for development purposes in a place like Indonesia or Brazil is seen as something that is antithetical to the interests of the global North. So when you ask your subjects, about the perception of in the Amazon paranoia, they may not be able to put a specific finger on a specific aspect of the Amazon, but they have internalized a discourse about development that the global North has a history of predatory relationships with the global South that has to do with dependency and so on, and we can unspool that. So how much is this just a reinvention or reconstitution of an older tension between the global South and Brazil in particular and the global North? Thanks.
That's a phenomenal question, Jeremy. Thank you so much. Yeah, totally. I'm going to give it a try, but the expert here is my colleague, Thiago Krause, who's here in the audience, who's a leading historian of Brazil. But here's a project I would love to do. If we did text analysis of history textbooks that Latin American kids read, I'm sure we'll find the origins of the Amazon paranoia right there. And it's not framed as Amazon paranoia early on. It's framed as foreigners who are all about sacking the riches of these wonderful natural places that we come from. And that gets built. It's certainly in my case. I grew up learning about colonialism age 6 in school. And the way I studied the maps is tied up with notions of colonialism and the way I interpreted national history. And indeed, I had to pass, like all my Brazilian friends here, I had to pass an entry exam for university in which you basically memorize a lot of history. And, there are correct answers, it's multiple choice, and wrong answers. And the correct answers are all the answers that denounce colonialism in one way or another. I'm not sure Thiago is agreeing with me, but that's the way I feel it, the way I sense it. So absolutely, this is tapping onto very deep terrain that goes well before the preoccupation with the Amazon and what we learn about the Amazon. It's to do with a worldview that looks at the world as a hierarchical place. And that to me is always the biggest shock whenever I come to Princeton or to the United States and I hear people talk about the international order and the international system. Because of course, if you're at the core, this looks like on the one hand, you have the story of a core liberal West that progressively expands. And that story is very powerful. This is the story John tells. Incredibly powerful story and true. But it's also an order that expands from the top down as well. And it's that top downness, it's that hierarchical dimensions to the story that I think come out with so much power. So yeah, my gut reaction is to say text analysis of history textbooks across Latin America and the global South. And there's going to be so much material there, I think.
I just want to put in a little plug here for a book that John Eikenberry, that you're involved in, the anthology on narratives, which one of the essential arguments of the premise of the anthology is that narratives frame how people understand, and that narratives themselves are contested terrains. So the very same moment, person, process like climate change can mean different things from different perspectives, depending on the narrative frameworks that people have forged. And so that might give you some pointers on, how to think about this, the cleavage that you see opening up. And there is let's say, a development narrative that is somewhat at odds with a kind of conservation narrative. And I wonder just whether we're seeing that clash unfolding here. Okay, so back to you, John, and your narrative project.
Well, Jeremy has a fantastic chapter in that volume and on precisely this issue. And the aggregate of the chapters is that we are in front of many narratives across time and space, and they are very powerful, arguably, in shaping debates and putting whatever comes down the road in perspective in a given place. Brazil, for the moment, there are these narratives that are passed down, that are embedded in society and textbooks, and they have this role. So it will be interesting to hear you place your research in that kind of context. I think that's what Jeremy suggested. That's very, very exciting.
Right. Super.
Thank you. Next, yes, please.
And my name is Julia Gomez. I have a master's in I'm actually working on the project on the EU as a next level of the climate governance. And so we got quite a big consortium that looks at what makes an active climate governance. So we really look at activeness as a necessary but not sufficient condition for effectiveness. What is compliance argument, but that doesn't change. And I think to your talk, I wondered about ambivalence because we present the global south and the connotation of private background. I do not want to challenge what we discussed about like the structure in the global government. Nevertheless, I also observe the global south is a very growing actor, especially in the global government. And when you look at the study of whether the EU is time and what factors determine the dynamics of the EU, we consider the governance, the external dimension of who is being recognized and plays an ever important role. There is active to recognize the EU. And when it comes to climate targets, such as the 1.5-degree target, the global south certainly plays a much more important role. And we can, I would argue, we can see it like a shift in the climate negotiations, and we can see a lot of influence for urban living for so ambivalence and interested in policy. And then I wondered why you think urban is when there is engagement among theoretical, very IR, by the really heavy angle of engagement.
Great questions. Okay, so as for this first set of comments, absolutely, I agree with you. I don't know the literature you're mentioning, but from what you describe, I agree. In fact, on a separate set of issues, my team and I are studying. We ran a series of experiments on reactions to foreign direct investment from China, the United States, and the European Union, and we tested it in Brazil. And to our utter surprise, the anti-China sentiment is absolutely overwhelming in Brazil, far higher than anti-American sentiment, which surprises me, or surprised me when it came out. But also surprising to me is the fact that the approach in the general population towards European investment is really very positive. We don't know why. The next step is trying to understand what determines these preferences, but these are the preferences. So yeah, speaking to your point about ambivalence, absolutely. Why did I pick the expression coercion, right? Not just because I'm an IR type, but because when the Kyoto Protocol broke down, What the world lost was the possibility of having a regime for curbing carbon emissions in which there were mechanisms to ensure compliance. There were mechanisms for enforcement, right? That's why the United States never signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. When Kyoto broke down, what the countries managed to do was a half-baked solution, which is the Paris Accords, which is each one pledges and reviews voluntarily no enforcement, proper enforcement mechanism other than naming and shaming. Every 5 years, you get your experts saying, well, you complied, you did well, you did not do well. Of course, the advantage of that system is that it lowers the costs of joining institutionalized cooperation, and this has allowed so many countries to come on board. We'll have to see what happens if this actually contributes to curbing carbon emissions, given the mechanisms for enforcement are what they are. My concern is that any policy that is based on pledge and review is a wonderful policy for powerful states, but it's a really bad policy for weak states, because weaker states are far more susceptible to suffering costs from naming and shaming than powerful states, because powerful states can avoid to drag their feet in ways that weaker states cannot. So the way I look at it, sitting there in Sao Paulo, from the global south, looking at what's happening in the rules that organize ordering around climate change, my sense is this will be a world of clubs, of like-minded clubs, where the United States takes the lead with this phenomenal investment that Biden is now making, and pulling with it European allies and maybe Japan, some European allies and maybe Japan. And for developing countries, this is enormously challenging. Enormously challenging. We have to remember the only times in the history of the global climate regime in which the United States made concessions, big concessions, these were moments in which the United States was isolated. And a system of pledge and review makes that kind of dynamic super difficult. That said, I don't want to sound like a hysterical global South person screaming at the United States. Not at all. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. All I'm saying is the way governance is evolving is one in which I think we better prepare for a lot of tension, because the mechanisms for producing cooperation are really quite weak, I think. A good test will be if Lula were to win the election. We will see what a Lula's cooperation with Biden might look like. My bet is, lower your expectations. There's going to be a lot of tension, I think, but I hope I'm wrong.
Other questions? Let's follow up with Jeremy. Jeremy, I can unmute you again, or I can ask this for you.
Well, it's a simple question. It's actually riffing off the last conversation you were having about, and it makes me wonder whether the source of the problem is really the policy, and it's not the divide or the rift in vision. Like here, I'm retracting from the narrative story, which is deeply structural, right? That there are embedded cleavages between the global north and the global south, but rather to say, in the absence of good distributive policies for coping with carbon mitigation, which has a lot to do with preserving forests and the need for capturing mechanisms, that the problem is, as you say, shaming. You rely on a terrible tool like shaming, and you produce the psychological backlash. If it were any other kind of policy that were, let's say, relied less on such brutal psychological tools, maybe we wouldn't see this divide. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And in fact, let's look at naming and shaming against the global north. There is one instance in which this happens, which is foreign aid for climate adaptation, right? Europe and the United States have made pledges to give, I can't remember how much money it is, to the developing world in the form of foreign aid. We are nowhere near that volume. So in theory, you have naming and shaming. And you do get that, you know, you walk into a multilateral setting there, and that's what you hear. And yet, does that have any effect? So naming and shaming, of all the tools possible to address a situation of structural inequality, of vast differences in power and influence, this is really, I think, historically, a bad one. So looking at the system from the standpoint of the global South, you know, there's a lot of nostalgia for Kyoto compared to what we have now. Look at what's happening with the private sector in the United States and Europe. These guys are now super empowered, which is a wonderful thing for the climate in many respects, of course. So wonderful that Biden managed to pass this package. But to what effect? Part of the effect, I think, will be that a lot of private governance beyond the state is going to start producing regulations of all sorts, as we've seen with the banking system. Look at the heads of the big banks in Congress 10 days ago, adopting a set of new procedures that will transform the way global finance operates, that have nothing to do with negotiations by states in Basel or in, you know, in proper institutions where each country has a vote, and, you know, Malawi can ask for the microphone and make its pledge. In that sense, I think the tension between naming and shaming on the one hand and structural inequality on the other is one that should worry us. And because these psychological dynamics that I was showing are so powerful, my concern is that moving forward, we're going to have a lot of clashes without institutions to mediate these clashes. So we may end up in a world that is more fractured politically around climate change, even as if the United States and its allies come in big time with top dollar to help.
I think part of the dilemma with the naming and the shaming is the perceived sense of hypocrisy, right? That name and shame Brazil after, let's say, the global North has gorged itself on fossil fuels for 2 centuries. It just seems so blatantly unfair and self-interested. So and one of the things we know about sense of hypocrisy is that is the thing that most provokes outrage and indignation, right? That one set of standard is being imposed on one party and not on the other.
Yeah, no, that's great. In fact,
play out now in over human rights issues. Abu Ghraib gets thrown back out onto the stage as how can Americans preach to us about atrocities when they committed so many in Iraq and so on and so forth.
So for early next year, we're going to run this experiment on hypocrisy, asking the question I was telling you about, whether there is a hypocrisy cost for the United States. And we're looking at 4 regimes. We're looking at free trade, democracy promotion, human rights, and the environment. And hopefully that will give us a fuller picture of the politics of hypocrisy. There's wonderful writing in international relations on hypocrisy, but there's very little empirical evidence to support it. A wonderful piece by Martha Finnemore, 2009, that sort of frames the debate in the area, but it's never been tested empirically, and that's what we want to do.
That's great. Well, we're coming towards the end. I have a question, but let me know for those who are still on raise your hand.
Hi, Mel Slideshow. I don't know many people here. I'm a PhD student, government at Cornell. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting talk. I was very impressed by the findings of your experiment, and I think your survey design is very interesting. You very carefully calibrate questions and try to probe different explanatory variables to gain leverage over understanding how criticism affects different types. Yet I find it very interesting think that at the outset, you explained to us also how there's so much noise in the South, that this criticism is only one policy that's often combined with also threats of economic sanctions. So I wonder if people, the audiences in the South, are actually processing that noise as they're reading or serving, thinking, yes, we do have naming and shaming, but we also know that there is aid or threat of sanctions. There is so much like combined all together. And I wonder if you think that if you wrap all of these measures together and prompted your respondents to ask them how they respond given all of these different measures together, you would get maybe different responses. And here I really wonder if we're operating in two different realms: the realm of problem identification from the North and the realm of seeking solutions. And if that realm of seeking solutions actually has one dynamic where the North gives aid and says this aid is conditional upon you using it in specific context, and the other realm where it's looking to foster local responses and local knowledge building and sharing as a mechanism for addressing this problem.
That's great, Alex. 2 points on that. So the first one is there's this wonderful book by Catherine Sicking called Mixed Signals, which is all about the North sending mixed signals around human rights issues in the 1970s to the Global South, in particular the Carter administration, and the costs and implications of situations in which you get mixed messages coming from Washington, right? So there's some theorizing around that, which might be interesting to look at. The other thing is, absolutely, you're spot on. And those are the experiments that need to be done around compensation. There are 2 papers on compensation. They look at whether publics in developing countries, in India in particular, accept compensation from the North, and what kinds of people accept compensation, what kinds of people do not accept compensation. And then comparing that to people in the United States that are compensated in coal communities and get compensation from government, right? There's a world out there to be explored, but I agree with you. If you were to confront a respondent with the range of possibilities, we might get something different, but then we wouldn't be able to isolate naming and shaming, right? So I think you're right. I think the way to go about it would be, once you've done naming and shaming, then do the positive incentives separately, and then do combined messages. Problem with that is that it's very expensive to run these survey experiments. But yes, I agree.
Matias, I have a question about the Amazon paranoia and the conjecture that you put forward. This is a little bit similar to what Jeremy asked and what Heather asked as well. So familiar themes here, but I would just like to ask you, to what extent is this actually paranoia, which is an irrational response, an irrational fear that is not really rooted in experience, maybe it's inductively rooted in experience, but it's blown out of all proportion to that experience, as opposed to what extent is this, at least for some people, a sort of a reasoned response to the structure of international agreements that are being designed in a very specific way to allow for very specific possibilities down the road. And I'm thinking here of a comparison that I think is salient for some of us in this room with the rise of neoliberalism and the way that it uprooted domestic bargains between the upper classes and the lower and the middle classes. And you had this kind of explosion of economic inequality across the Western countries happen under the aegis of international policies that were nominally designed to facilitate economic progress and the blossoming of wealth and prosperity and so forth, but in reality made possible domestic and transnational moves that nearly exacerbated the inequality, even though that wasn't stated purpose. So to what extent are we here dealing with genuine paranoia, as opposed to, at least for some people, again, I mean, maybe for some it is full paranoia, but at least for some, a reasoned assessment of these more cynical possibilities?
Fantastic, great question. So let me begin with an anecdote. The other day I was having lunch with one of Brazil's top diplomatic climate negotiators, and I was showing him these results, and he went and said, "Why'd you call this Amazon paranoia, quote unquote?" And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, it's not paranoia, it's reality." And I said, "What do you mean it's reality? Give me an example." of any third party trying to sequester control over the Amazon from you. And he said, well, but of course they tried to do it. I said, who's they? Well, you know, the white powers. This is a white Brazilian guy, right? White Brazilian league guy. The white powers, the Europeans and the Americans. So give me concrete examples. And there are no concrete examples, but there is a sense that over history, if you will let them, they will introduce norms and regulations that will limit Brazil's ability to exercise sovereign authority over the territories of the Amazon. So there is something to it. I think it's to do with what Jeremy was saying. There's 500 years of colonialism there to support it. But I do think it's blown out of proportion, but not just because of psychology. I think this is politically motivated. And this takes me to your second question, neoliberalism uprooting. There's that dynamic to be sure, but there is the opposite dynamic, which is conservative society that is deeply detrimental of the environment, that hides behind the shield of sovereignty. So interest groups in Brazil that are anti-climate, that are all about exploiting the environment in ways that are utterly unsustainable, that violate every single norm in the book, these guys hide under the Amazon partner. Well, of course, you must not sign on to international agreements, because after all, if you do that, you're handing over control, right? And this produces this phenomenon in Brazil and in Indonesia. And that's why I think it's so interesting to work on these two cases. Both Brazil and Indonesia are the possessors of the two largest forest tracts in the world. And these two countries have militarized control of the forest. The military control the forest and are the main actors, public actors operating in the forest. And this is not about securitization. It's not about going to war in the forest. It's about using the forest economically. The military used the forest as a tool of rent seeking, hiding behind the shield of sovereignty. So whenever I see that, I become a cosmopolitan and, I want to cheer for Macron immediately, because it has the opposite effect of what you just mentioned. So it cuts both ways.
Well, I want to check with Toya, is there an online question to wrap up with, or should we stop? I think basically that will be the last question and the last answer. So, Matias, thank you so much. Will you join me? And thank you.
Thank you, John.
So Matias will be here through the academic year, so we will have a chance to hear more about the findings that he will be pursuing over the course of the next 6 months, and we'll get answers to those last questions as we go forward. So thank you very much. There is a reception outside, so we invite you to stay around for a few more minutes and have a drink and some little edibles, and we'll continue the conversation. So again, thank you, and to those online, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Jeremy.